It's a great pleasure for me as Master of Students that I've been asked to introduce our Treasurer, Lady Justice Geraldine Andrews. Well, what do you need to know about our Treasurer? All good law students know that you should never do your legal research on ChatGPT. But I was curious, so I had a little look. And it said this: Lady Justice Andrews is one of the most senior and experienced judges in the English appellate system, with decades of experience in high-level commercial litigation, international arbitration and appeals, both civil and criminal. Her rise as a barrister in Essex Court Chambers to a High Court judge and then the Court of Appeal demonstrates a highly distinguished career, and her textbook work and deep commitment to advocacy training reflect her influence on both jurisprudence and legal education. Well, my verdict is that's only half right. And that's because there's so much more to our Treasurer, Geraldine Andrews. Geraldine chose the theme this year, education. And that's a very apt theme because Geraldine has been highly committed to education for very many years. She's been Master of Education and Master of Advocacy at the Inn, and a tireless supporter of the Education Department and advocacy training in this jurisdiction and internationally. She's highly respected as an advocacy trainer, both in this jurisdiction and abroad, and I can attest to that. I was with Geraldine in Singapore and Malaysia on our Amity visit this year, and it was like being with Geraldine's fan club. Everybody wanted to see her. Most of us have been trained to be advocacy trainers under Geraldine, and many of the training materials that we use at the Inn have been designed by her. But someone else would say, well, that's only part of the story. Those of us who know Geraldine also know that she represents the best of the warmth and camaraderie that the Inn offers. She's also highly talented, both as a violinist and often has a starring role in the Christmas Miscellany. She also tells very good jokes. So turning then to our talk tonight, the Treasurer has chosen the theme of great advocates for her lecture series, and it is fitting that the culmination of this series will feature a member of the Inn who has selflessly committed himself to the education and development of the next generation of advocates, exactly the way that Geraldine has. So, members of Hall, guests of Gray's Inn, I present our Treasurer, Lady Justice Geraldine Andrews.
Thank you, Georgina, for those undeservedly warm words of welcome. And good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome from me to our guests from the London School of Economics and from Women in Law. I count myself as a sort of half alumna of the LSE because I did part of my master's degree there long before you were all born. So it's very nice to see you in Hall. In every era, indeed in every generation, in any field of human endeavour which involves public performance, be it sport, music, acting, comedy, or dance, there will be a small handful of individuals who stand out even amongst those who are recognised as the leaders in their field. There is something about those individuals which marks them out as exceptional and which leaves a lasting impression on those who witness them perform. It is instantly recognisable, including by their peers, but impossible to identify what some people might describe as star quality. The Romans had an expression for it, primus inter pares, meaning first among equals. It may be possible to identify certain attributes or characteristics which these special people display. For example, one can point to the grace and athleticism of Roger Federer on a tennis court, or to the vocal range and tone colour of Whitney Houston's amazing voice, or the almost childlike innocence and silliness of Eric Morecambe, or the amazing leg extensions of the ballet dancer Sylvie Guillem, or to the manual dexterity and musical sensibilities of Ravi Shankar playing the sitar, or to the sheer dynamism of Laurence Olivier. You could feed all of those identifiable traits into the most intelligent AI system, and it might come up with an imitation. But it will never replicate that unique something over and above a mere combination of those traits which makes them special. Tribute bands may be extremely accomplished, but they cannot replace the real thing. My godson, Nicholas, was a teenager at a time when the band Oasis were at the height of their fame. He brought some friends home one afternoon and they were playing some Oasis tracks when his mother walked into the room and asked the boys if they had ever heard the Beatles. When they said no, she went off and fetched one of the Beatles albums that they had and played it to them. It proved to be a revelation. Having heard the real thing, they were not prepared to go back. Each one of those boys then went out and formed their own collection of Beatles records and spread the word. Genius is something that you cannot replicate. Now, we may not be able to reach the same dizzying heights as those special individuals, but they still have power to inspire us, to go on to achieve the best that we can. In the modern era, we may have the advantage of recordings that we can listen to or watch on YouTube. And although they can never quite capture the magic of live performances, there will still be much to admire and lessons that we can take away. Advocacy is a performance skill, though it has only been recognized as such in relatively recent times. Even in the mid-1990s, those who espoused advocacy training were seen as maverick minority, and the prevailing wisdom was that you were either born with natural talent or you somehow acquired it by experience through a process of osmosis by watching your pupil supervisor or other barristers. Nowadays, we recognize that one of the great strengths of our oral advocacy tradition is that each individual is unique and each can bring their own personality to the table when it comes to communicating in a court environment. Whilst there is such a thing as exceptional talent, and all the training in the world will not transform someone who does not possess it, that training can help everyone to make the best of their strengths and to address their weaknesses. Even the Roger Federers of this world need some help to reach their full potential. What I have said about the greats in other fields of public performance applies equally to the great advocates. But unlike other types of performer, we will rarely have any form of record of their performances. After all, recording is not allowed in court. And it's only in recent years that we've been able to live stream appeals from the Court of Appeal, at least on the civil side of things. In the case of my subject this evening, we do have some record. Those of you who might be able to trawl through the internet should be able to find recordings of James Hunt in a mock trial that was put on by, I think, either Channel 4 or ITV some years back. But we also have a DVD of a talk that he gave as part of a lecture series to the Southeastern Circuit some years ago, which was a wonderful series and which I used to play to our pupils as a form of inspiration to them at the start of, or even sometimes at the end of their pupil course. We have a copy of that in the Gray's Inn archive, and I believe that work is being carried out on it in order to truncate it because it needs to be adapted for modern sensibilities. But I am hopeful that one day we will get it up on the website and you'll all able to see for yourself just what a wonderful speaker James Hunt was. In every generation, there will be a handful of advocates who have that special something about them. In some cases, that reputation will long survive their passing. The names of Edward Marshall Hall, Norman Burkitt, and Effie Smith, whose portrait is up there, are still recognised, as are the names of the great advocates whose lives we have celebrated earlier this year in the first 3 lectures in this series: George Carman, Rose Heilbrunn, and Sidney Kentridge. So why have I included James Hunt amongst their number? A man whose practice was largely centred in the Midlands, with the occasional foray to the Old Bailey, and he was only 13 years in silk before he became a High Court judge. Why is it that the Library of Nottingham Trent University bears his name? And why is it that this inn awards a prestigious annual prize in his name for the best advocacy performance by a pupil at the trial exercise? I was happy to see that some of the past winners of that prize are now in silk. Well, I have not chosen to speak about him because James was both a personal mentor and a close personal friend of mine, nor just because we are about to approach the 20th year of his untimely death from brain cancer. When presenting the Hunt Prize at the start of my Treasurer's year, it suddenly came home to me that there are fewer and fewer of us who remember what it was that made him such a special advocate, one of the handful of those very special individuals. And it was about time that some of us who were still able to pass on that knowledge would do so, because there is still much to be learnt from the identifiable traits which he personified, even if it is impossible to replicate that extra special something that marked him out as being so extraordinary. So let me deal with the biographical details first before going on to address those traits. Patrick James Hunt was born in January 1943 in Coalville, Leicestershire. His father was a solicitor. He was educated at a local grammar school and won a place to read modern history at Oxford. But like many with a first-class brain who found studies easy and extracurricular activities more attractive, he ended up graduating with a third-class degree. He spent much of his time involved in drama, in the local Gilbert and Sullivan Operatic Society, and in organising debates, moots, and the like. While studying for his bar exams, he went back to his old school as a housemaster, teaching English. He managed to elevate the C-grade class to the same standard as the A-grade class in the space of a year. It was also an important year for him because that's where he met his wife and soulmate, Sue, whom he married not long after. In 1968, he was called to the bar by this inn, and he went on to do his pupillage in a mixed crime and common law set, which was then based at 1 King's Bench Walk in the Temple, but had very strong links to what was then known as the Midland and Oxford Circuit. His practice over the years that ensued mainly centred on crime, and he both prosecuted and defended like all the best criminal advocates, although he had a useful sideline in personal injury and clinical negligence cases. After taking silk in 1987 and becoming head of chambers, which had now by then moved to 36 Bedford Row, he first came to prominence more widely as one of the defence counsel in the Matrix Churchill Arms to Iraq trial in 1992. That case caused a huge scandal. It led to an infamous public inquiry chaired by Sir Richard Scott, later Lord Scott of Foscott. Matrix Churchill was a precision engineering company based in Coventry. It made specialist equipment, some of which was capable for adaptation for military purposes. After the company got into financial difficulties in the late 1980s, it was taken over, and new directors were appointed, some of whom were said to be linked to Iraqi intelligence. There was at the time an embargo on supplying arms to Iraq, which was then very firmly under the governance of Saddam Hussein. A whistleblower revealed that the company was exporting equipment under license, which was capable of being adapted in Iraq for military use. In consequence of this, the police carried out an investigation, and the managing director, Paul Henderson, and 3 other directors were prosecuted for breaching export license controls. In the course of the trial, it came to light that Henderson had been acting as an undercover agent for MI6, gleaning information whilst on business trips to Iraq at great personal cost. He was a very brave man. The trial continued until there was a moment, a denouement, which, if you put it in fiction, probably nobody would believe. Alan Clark, who had been the trade minister under Margaret Thatcher's government, told the court under oath that he had encouraged the company to turn a blind eye to the military uses to which their equipment could be put by Iraqi scientists. In answer to questions in cross-examination about misleading statements that he had made in Parliament and elsewhere, he famously admitted to being, quote, economical with the actualité, close quote. James wasn't involved at the later stages with the Scott inquiry, which showed that there had been the most enormous attempt to cover up what was going on, and indeed that if it hadn't been for the moral rectitude of Michael Heseltine, who had refused to sign a certificate certifying that public interest immunity attached to certain of the documents which were incriminating of the way that the government had behaved, innocent men would have gone to prison. And in fact, a number of innocent men did, and their convictions were quashed by the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. It was therefore a case which made a great deal of noise at the time, and obviously those involved in it became household names, James amongst them. But the following year was probably the case with which James is most associated. He was defence counsel for a woman named Beverly Allett. All of you in this hall will probably know something about the Lucy Letby trial. A case which is at the moment even being the subject of an inquiry, and which involves a nurse who was convicted of killing a number of children in the hospital under her care. Sadly, it's not the first occasion of its kind. Beverly Allett also was charged with murder and attempted murder of children in her care, in a case which has chilling echoes of the Letby case. As in the Letby case, the evidence against her was painstakingly assembled from circumstantial evidence, showing her presence at the time of the deaths or serious injuries that the children sustained. There was also expert evidence from a paediatrician. The defence, which James had to conduct, involved painstaking examination of the minutiae of medical and other evidence, in order to attempt to show that the prosecution could not prove to the criminal standard that the deaths were not due to natural causes, which initially they were believed to be. The case was prosecuted by Sir John Goldring, who was an old friend of James. And after the trial concluded with the conviction of Allett for 4 murders and 3 attempted murders, they went on to discuss it in a forum in which each paid huge tribute to the forensic skills of the other in handling with great sensitivity a very, very difficult case. Allett eventually confessed, but it was not for many, many years that she did so. James always described it as one of the most difficult cases that he ever had to undertake, because finding the balance between looking after the interests and the sensibilities of the victims and their families and trying to put together a defence case which was coherent was a real challenge. In 1997, James was prosecuting counsel in a rather lurid murder case. The defendant was a groom at a riding stables, Clem O'Brien, and he was charged with the murder of a racehorse trainer named Alex Scott. Scott, who was in his early 30s, had made a huge impression in the flat racing world. But O'Brien did not agree with his management style, and the two had a falling out after Scott had told a bloodstock agent that the time that his client wished to visit the yard to view a potential purchase was inconvenient. There was a major argument. O'Brien handed in his resignation, and 2 days later he turned up at the yard to clear out his possessions, which had been kept in a barn. The prosecution case was that he even then planned to get even with Scott after his possessions had been cleared out. He shot Scott in the back with a single-barrel shotgun. The defence was manslaughter by provocation. James secured guilty verdicts by a 10-2 majority, and again, a case that involved a great deal of care and sensitivity. Well, that's just the edited highlights of a career which then went on to appointment to the High Court in the Queen's Bench Division, and was sadly curtailed when James developed a brain tumour, which he fought manfully for 4 years until he died in November 2006. So what are the characteristics of this remarkable man that I can tell you about? What was it that made him so exceptional? When you ask people who appeared in court against him or were led by him, the first thing they mention is his voice. Now, whereas his contemporary and another marvellous advocate, Nicholas Price, Queen's Counsel, had a voice that was famously described as being like melted chocolate, and it really was. James had a rich, I suppose, espresso tone, but there was a little bit of grit in it at the bottom of the cup, probably provided by his Leicestershire accent, which he never completely lost, but he used to great effect because he sounded grounded and he sounded like a man of the people and not somebody who had been subjected to elocution lessons. He also had the great advantage, or some might regard it as a disadvantage, of a voice that naturally projected. As a singer himself, and a very accomplished one, he knew how to use his diaphragm, but he had a natural command over it. He could fill a room without the need for a microphone at any stage. And you always knew when James was in the room, largely because of the amount of noise around him that he generated. That brings me to the question of presence. James was not a super tall man. I would have said he was probably just under 6 feet tall. He was broad-shouldered, he wasn't fat, but he had a solidity about him. And there was a sort of comforting presence to him, which made you want to trust him or listen to what he had to say. He also was quite magnetic in terms of attracting people to come and talk to him. This was not necessarily a trait which went down terribly well with his fellow advocates who were trying quietly to prepare in the robing room in ahead of a trial. One of them told me that one day there was the usual hubbub going on in the corner of the robing room, and he decided to get up and remonstrate with James. James looked him up and down and said, "Well, when the circus is in town, somebody's got to act as ringmaster." His pace and his timing was impeccable. I think this was partly as a result of his love of poetry, which he also wrote. He could quote great chunks of T.S. Eliot by heart. He loved the rhythm and the feel of poetry at all ages and all levels, from silly child's verses to the most profound metaphysical poetry. And he often used to read it out loud. He said to me that it was something that was a very good tip for all young aspiring advocates. It would help them to get into the natural rhythm and to experiment with pace and pausing and knowing exactly where to lay the accent or the stress in a line. He would often go and tell young people like yourselves to go and practice in the bathroom and just read a couple of verses of blank verse to yourselves. Hopefully having sent your nearest and dearest well away in case they thought that you'd taken leave of your senses. So there was that wonderful way of knowing how to pace. And he also had great comic timing. James was a naturally funny man. He was one of the most gifted after dinner speakers I've ever heard. The problem was that if you made the mistake of eating a lot at the meal, you would learn to regret it. I once sat through an after dinner speech when we took new practitioners away for a residential weekend in Northamptonshire to a place called Highgate House. The hall was about the same size as this hall, and it was like a huge baronial hall with stags' heads and so forth around it. And there were long trestle tables. Because we had so many teachers and trainees and new practitioners there, there was an overspill into the hall next door. So everybody had crowded in. As James was delivering his speech, I noticed that the person sitting next to me was clutching their stomach so hard that I honestly thought that she was going to slide under the table. And everybody in the house was virtually weeping with laughter. I think he could have made a career as a stand-up comedian, but he never used his humour inappropriately in court. And he never used it maliciously or cruelly. There were never any jibes at the expense of anybody else. It was witty, it was funny. On occasion, it could be a little near the bone in social context, but never in court. And it was always funny. You would never take offence at anything that James would say. I'll give you a few examples in due course. People skills. James had a knack of tapping into what I call the spirit of the ages. He treated everybody alike, speaking to them in the same way, regardless of whether they were a student or a law lord. He once said to me that, you treat the Duchess like a dairymaid and the dairymaid like a duchess. And there was some truth about that. So juries would never feel that they were being talked down to, but rather that it was like a conversation in a pub with a friend over a pint or two, in common sense, plain English. Now, that was part of his personality, but it was also the result of a great deal of hard work. He honed and polished what he was going to say with great rigour and chose his words extremely carefully. He was also very good at sort of tapping into the spirit of the times. By that, I don't mean getting down with the kids and speaking slang. He just sort of knew what captured the popular imagination. In his final trial as prosecuting counsel before he was appointed to the High Court bench, he was prosecuting a murder I think it was Sheffield, it might have been Nottingham, and it was a city anyway where there was a canal or a river. And the accused had tied up the victim, bound him hand and foot, put him into the boot of a car, which they then shut, and pushed the car into the canal. Obviously, the prosecution case was that this was premeditated murder. James got up to address the jury. Members of the jury, he said, I'd like you to imagine that you are participants in one of those game shows. Now, at that time, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? The Tarrant version was at the height of its popularity. And suppose that you're asked to choose between these options. When the defendants got together, trussed up the defendant like a turkey, threw him into the boot of the car, slammed the boot shut and pushed it into the water. Were they A, trying to see how long it would take before the car got to the other side of the canal? B, doing an experiment to replicate one of Harry Houdini's escapology escapades? Or C, trying to finish him off? Well, you wouldn't need to phone a friend, would you? In terms of his preparation, James was meticulous. He told me once that when he seemed to be dealing with an unbreakable alibi, he went down to the location of the murder to try and work out how it was that the accused could have got away without being seen, checking the CCTV cameras in the area. It turned out that that he unearthed the fact that the accused had been a postal worker and had done a postal round in that area and knew that particular remote area extremely well. He also discovered something that the police hadn't found, which was that there was a gap between the hedge and the path down to, I think it was a beach, where the body was found. As a result of carefully crafted questions of the accused, in cross-examination, James got his man and managed to satisfy the jury that the prosecution case was a sound one. However, James wasn't always infallible. And one of his most endearing traits was the fact that he was always willing to send himself up or to tell jokes at his own expense. He told me once of a case, I can't remember now whether he was prosecuting or defending, but it was important that the witness that he called should give evidence about what her sister had been doing the previous Saturday, or rather what the sister told her she'd been doing the previous Saturday. If it was hearsay, it was admissible under one or other rule, and it was an important plank in the case that he was seeking to make out. The trial took place in Wolverhampton, and without meaning any disrespect to people from that district, the Wolverhamptonian accent can sometimes be a little difficult to penetrate. However, as a Midlander himself, you might have expected James to be able to cope. He asked the witness a question. And so, what did your sister say that she was doing last week? The response came back, Ursus went up, didn't I? There was a pause. James said, I didn't quite catch that, madam. Could you possibly repeat it? Witness growing impatient. Ursus went up, didn't I? James, with some trepidation, asks the witness to repeat it more slowly. The judge, a local, tapped his fingers impatiently on the bench and said, Mr. Hunt, it's perfectly understandable. The witness said her sister told her that she'd gone to Dudley. Ursus, she said, went to, Dudley, didn't I? Ursus Dudley, didn't I? He said he really felt that he needed a translator the next time he appeared in Wolverhampton, but at least the judge understood. Another occasion when James almost came unstuck, it was a case of the unbreakable alibi. He was prosecuting, and a young man who had been charged with a string, I think, of armed robberies, called as one of his alibi witnesses his aged auntie, a woman who appeared to be of impeccable character, probably in her late 80s, and, one of those really unshakable witnesses. James knew that if he was going to cross-examine this woman, he was going to have to do so with great care, great delicacy. So with scrupulous politeness, he very gently put it to the lady that perhaps her memory was mistaken as to the date on which her nephew had called around for morning tea, when in fact there was quite a lot of evidence that he was committing an armed robbery somewhere else in the country. The aunt drew herself up to her full 5'4" and looked at James pityingly. Young man, she said, I will have you know that the 4th of August was the birthday of the late Queen Mother. And my friend Ethel and I, every year, we used to go down to St. James's Palace to see Her Majesty and to wish her well with our Union flags. But unfortunately, Ethel is no longer with us. I am confined to quarters in my flat, and so I always have to watch the procession and the celebrations for Her Majesty's birthday on the television. And that is why I remember that my nephew Raymond came round that morning with a bunch of flowers for me, and he stayed for tea. Well, devastating, isn't it? You can't go back from that. James didn't try. He sat down. He was extremely surprised when the jury convicted on that count and acquitted on all the others. He said there's nothing more strange than how a jury reads a witness. And although he had a great feel for juries, he never really quite got over that particular case. Another story he told me was after years of advocacy training in which he excelled. He was co-defending in a case involving multiple defendants who were accused of conspiring to rob a bank. There was an inside job, and one of the perpetrators who worked for the bank had turned what was then known as Queen's evidence. In other words, had joined the prosecution in return for immunity. And that was the star witness. And unless they could break the star witness, all of them were going down. James, I think, was number 3 or 4 on the indictment. It must have been 4, I think. Number 3 on the indictment was represented by a lovely man called Willie Kahn. Willie was a junior. He had many qualities, but shortness was not one of them. Brevity was not one of them. One of the Silks passed James a note saying, we're good for another couple of days here because, it's going to take Willie quite a while to cross-examine this witness. I should say that all of the defendants were Bengali. At the beginning of the trial, prosecution opens the case, and then the defence comes to cross-examine the star witness. Posh Silk number 1 gets up, has a go. Witness is completely unshaken. No, he's sticking to his story. He was there. They were all party to it. They were definitely in it to do this robbery. So Silk sits down looking rather deflated, and number 2 Silk gets up and has another go, tries it from a different angle. Still the witness remains completely unshaken. Willie Kahn's turn. Everybody thinks they're good for another day. Willie starts his cross-examination. You are lying. The witness says, I am not lying. I tell you, you are lying. Witness, I am not lying. Let me put it another way, says Willie. You are not telling the truth. Witness, I am telling the truth. It goes on in that sort of way for another 5 minutes or so. And eventually Willie gets up and he points the finger at the witness and goes, you are lying, you are lying. I can see it in your eyes that you are lying. And the witness goes, only a little bit. And the trial collapsed. And James turned to his fellow Silks and said, why are we teaching people advocacy training? Willie has the in him, he understands. He has an advantage over us because he understands the right buttons to press. And he knew what was going to get that chap to confess that he wasn't telling the truth. And sometimes you can have an advantage, a cultural advantage or a heritage advantage, or it could be just an advantage of local knowledge that will give you that extra something. And that was the lesson that James took away from the Willie Kahn story. Well, as I round up the end of this lecture, let me tell you about some of James's tips on preparation. For somebody who didn't primarily practice in the civil sphere, James had a great deal of tips that he could give. And indeed, I think amongst our papers for the pupils, there's still a copy of a paper that he wrote about skeleton arguments and how to draft them. I learned a great deal from that. One of his tips, for example, was to put your name on the front of the document and to identify by name the party you were referring to and who you were actually representing, so that the judge could see at a glance in a mountain of respondents that the third respondent was John Smith. Very simple tip, but it works extremely well. He also advised counsel to use a large enough font that the judge didn't have to peer through a magnifying glass, to avoid footnotes, and to give everything a coherent and logical structure with headings. Again, it might seem sensible and it might seem obvious, but people weren't doing it in those days. And James had the courage to be able to tell people that they should be able to keep their submissions short and keep one point to each sentence and use clear, plain English. He also said that in order to be able to create a coherent structure, you needed to know what the end result was. So you needed a plan from going back. You needed to know what the end result would be and what you were going to say in your final speech. He said that there were only a few things that people knew about Christopher Columbus. When he set off, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he came back, he didn't know where he'd been. And he'd done it all at somebody else's expense. Now, he said, you don't want to be the Christopher Columbus of advocacy. You need to know what your destination is in order to be able to get there as fast as you possibly can. He was a masterly exponent of case analysis and was able to hone down his questions into 10 or 11, but they would be devastating. And he always had a tip that I adopted, which was that before he proceeded to examine or cross-examine any witness, he would write the word establish in his counsel's notebook at the top, with bullet points underneath it as to each point that he needed to establish with that witness. He felt that that anchored him because if the witness went off on a tangent and he had to follow up with a different line of questioning from those he'd prepared, he always had that checklist to go back and look at. And he also knew when to stop. As soon as he got all the material he wanted, he was able to sit down, realizing that the list was ticked off. My final James story was given to me by his junior, Helen Malcolm, who was one of the many female advocates whose cause he promoted. James was very much in favour of female advocates and was a great protagonist. And he often worked with a female junior. James and Helen were doing a case in Oxford Crown Court. He tried to row their client out at half time because the evidence against him was pretty thin. But the judge was having none of it and left it to the jury. To Helen's surprise, and not without a little trepidation when she heard it, James decided he was going to make possibly the closest final speech in history. I think it ought to be in the Guinness Book of Records. He got up, he looked at the jury, said, "Well, really," and sat down. His client was acquitted. That's the measure of star quality. It came naturally, but there was still an awful lot of inspiration and a great deal that you could learn from a marvellous, marvellous exponent of a performance art. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, Geraldine. So I did tell you there might be some good jokes. I think we now get to start the rest of the evening.
Well, there might be some questions. Do we have any questions?
Ah,
I've got the mic.
microphone. Okay. Oh, there's one.
There's one here. We'll get the mic because otherwise they can't hear you online.
How do you think you should approach bringing comedy into advocacy? Is it something you plan in advance or something that's more spur of the moment?
Well, you've got to be very careful because it depends on the nature of the case and it depends on the judge as well. If you are dealing with a case which is very grim and involves victims who've been really badly hurt, then levity isn't really called for. But sometimes it can be judged very carefully. You don't crack jokes because a courtroom is a serious place. And they often say that the only person who cracks the jokes is the judge. Well, even the judge shouldn't really do it because everybody politely laughs whether they think it's funny or not. But sometimes a little witticism of some kind can actually help to punctuate the atmosphere in a way that will lighten up. And you just have to decide whether it feels right, is the answer. If you're a naturally funny person like James, he always judged it to perfection. You know, he could use humor in order to relate to the jury, so that members of the jury, you know, were amused but on side. I think that's a particular skill, and it's something that you can't necessarily develop, but it's a question of feel.
Thank you so much for the great talk. It's so great being here with so many lawyers, barristers. It's amazing. But I'm myself in the early stages of my career, whether what path do I want to choose and how do I want to shape my career? So my question would be around your motivations. How did you and why did you decide that you wanted to pursue the bar? But also, how did you sustain your motivation and came to where you are today?
Well, I never had any problem in deciding which branch of the profession I was going into because I'm basically unemployable. I don't think I could survive in a solicitor's office taking directions from other people. So for me, it was a question of if I was going into law, that was what I was going to do. But there were no lawyers in my family, and it was just happenstance that, as somebody who, Georgina's explained that I am a performer, I'm used to getting up and doing silly things in public and will be next week. So when a lady came to our school to talk about careers in law, she said to me, I gather from the headmistress that you tend to be the spokesperson when somebody needs to put the point of view of the class to the teachers. And I said, well, I suppose I am. And she said, do you know why that is? And I said, well, probably because I'm quite used to dealing with adults. You know, I'm the youngest in my family by 12 years. I'm used to my sister's friends coming in. I'm used to talking to my parents' contemporaries. And I realized that if you are polite and ask questions, they will usually answer them, and that there's nothing to be frightened of by that. And she said, have you ever thought about becoming a barrister? To which my response was, well, no. It seems to me that it's a horribly, you know, don't you need to have connections and you need to have at least some connections in the law. It's very male dominated. And she got quite cross. And she looked me in the eye and she said, I was brought up, she said, to believe that cream rises to the surface of the milk. If you've got what it takes, you'll get there. And then she said, could she send me the literature? So I read the literature and I started learning about the profession. And I came downstairs from my bedroom and announced to my totally dumbfounded parents that I was going to be a barrister. And that's how I've got to where I've got to. So that's the answer. But sustaining the motivation, no, I mean, you go through peaks and troughs. Obviously, there are disappointments. I think what you have to do is to learn from the setbacks because we all have them. And you've got to be able to learn to pick yourself up and say to yourself, well, what's the lesson I can learn from this? Because actually sometimes getting something is sweeter if you don't get it first time. And so you have to say to yourself, well, what could I have done better? What could I have done to improve my chances with that? And you now find people getting pupillage at their third or fourth attempt, simply because they are willing to persist and they're motivated. But this profession is not a profession to go into unless you are completely sure that it's the only thing you want to do. You've got to be passionate about it. It's not there to do just as a job that will make you a lot of money, although for some people it does, and for some people it doesn't. You really, really have to believe that, and you have to learn to believe in yourself. I honestly don't know. And for those online, our microphone has just died. I've been asked with the changes to jury trials, how do I envisage it affecting people at the bar? I don't think that changes to procedure are likely to affect people in the profession, because a trial is a trial is a trial, and it still needs an advocate. And addressing a judge as a fact finder is no different than addressing a jury, except that you've got to convince 12 people instead of one. And so it's the same advocacy skill, it's the same communication skill. You need to be a good communicator. So, you know, somebody like me who practiced all their life in civil work and never addressed a jury, I still think that it's a question of honing your communication skills and being able to convince the person that you're addressing to come round to your point of view, or your client's point of view. In fact, you are a mouthpiece, and you have to do the best that you can with the material you've got. And you've got to make up you've got to realize that you won't always win. Even if your case appears to be strong, the judge might disagree with you, but nevertheless, you've got to do your best.
So you've said we should take inspiration from James Hunt. Which advocate did James Hunt take inspiration from?
Well, I think there were quite a few out on the circuit on which he practiced. I think one of his great heroes actually was a contemporary of his called Gilbert Gray, also a member of this inn. And according to my predecessor, Lord Justice Coulson, the best treasurer that this inn never had, although I would vie with him on that. I think James was probably the best treasurer that this inn never had. But Gilly was a legend and had the most wonderful courtroom manner, wit, and again, presence. There are a lot of great advocates who can just fill a courtroom. And Gilbert Gray and James Hunt were amongst them. And I think those are the sort of inspirations, other than people who I never saw and wouldn't know. There was another great advocate called Michael Sherard, who James revered, who mainly practiced in the employment sphere, and who was a Middle Templar. And I know that when James did the series of when he contributed to the series of lectures, he was quite overcome by the fact that he had to follow Michael Sherard giving a similar speech, because he was very much in awe of Michael's delivery skills. So those, I think, are the two names that immediately come to mind. Are there any questions online, Tony?
If we take this one in hall, Treasurer, and then we've got one online to ask.
Yes.
So I spoke to a solicitor recently, and I told him I was doing the bar, and he said, "Oh, why would you get into a dying profession? Because solicitors are, in real life, apparently, solicitors are allowed to do a lot of the work the barristers can do," was what he said. So I guess my question is, where do you see advocacy in the next 50 years?
Well, they were predicting the demise of the bar before I started. So that answers your question. Whatever system you have, and I've been to many other countries where they have a fused profession, we are the envy of the rest of the world for the way that we deal with things, because you can't do it all. And you will have specialist trial advocates in a fused profession, in the same way as you will have solicitors and barristers. Somebody will have to do the prep. It's a very special skill, being a solicitor. I once gave a reference for a young woman who was one of my instructing solicitors team, who desperately wanted her high rights of audience. And she was intelligent, articulate, had all that was going for her. And I said, yes, of course, I'll support you. And I did. I saw her about 3 years after she got her higher rights, and I said, how are you getting on? She said, it was a waste of time. I said, why? She said, I hardly ever get into court to use those skills. And when I do, I feel rusty, because if the case is worth pursuing, they'll go to external counsel. And it's very, very rare. Now, it may well be that in certain tribunal systems, you will get more solicitor advocates, and you will get the odd one in court. I had a very good one in court today in front of me. But they are still the exception rather than the rule. So I don't think the bar is dying out. I don't think we need to panic just yet. And I don't think artificial intelligence is going to take over our jobs.
Just one question that we've got time for, I'm afraid, online, and we'll have to make this the last before dinner. It's a question which is how did Gray's Inn support the development of advocacy skills for James Hunt? So more generally, when James was a student, how was advocacy trained at the inn? There wasn't any, is the short answer. James had to deal with it without, as did I. There wasn't any when I started. It was a remarkable Australian judge called George Hampel who came over to this jurisdiction at the invitation of Michael Hill, QC, who had been to South Africa and seen the work that the Australians and the South Africans were doing in pioneering advocacy training by taking on and applying to common law jurisdictions a methodology which had first been developed by the Americans in an institute called NITA. Michael Hill invited George Hampel to come to this hall to address an audience of the great and the good, headed up by the Lord Chief Justice at the time, Geoffrey Lane. And there were an awful lot of skeptics sitting around, but James was there with a number of the pioneer advocacy trainers. And fortunately, George Hampel managed to convince Lord Lane that this was something worth pursuing. It's thanks to Lord Lane that Gray's Inn has the privilege of being the only one of the 4 inns of court which is able to use the Royal Courts of Justice to carry out our pupillage trial exercise at the end of the pupil training. And it's thanks to the faith of some of the great and the good who sat in that hall on that occasion that we actually have the advocacy training system that we have adopted and which you will all become very familiar with, which has been spread out throughout the Commonwealth now. So he had to cope on his own, I'm afraid, and a lot of us did. And we wish we'd had it. But you've got the benefit of it, and good luck to you because you make the most of it. Right, thank you all. I think it's time for dinner.